the background was that communities and community management, which have always been around, are becoming even more popular today. We're not only seeing them be relevant in knowledge management, but also in marketing and brand management has become a big deal for them. And for some people, communities is a brand new concept, but it's not really brand new. In fact, if you go back in time, communities have been around a long time. Even before we even used the term, there were guilds and there were trade organizations and professional societies and so forth. So we've had this kind of concept for a long time. And when I came to Australia in 2010 at Arthur's invitation, I did address the KMLF about the Communities Manifesto, which was relatively new at that time. And then, as he mentioned, I just published last year this book, Handbook of Community Management, which includes details on the 10 principles. So I thought we'd pick out 4 of them today for discussion. So we'll review the 4 of the principles. We'll share insights from our experiences. I hope you'll all join in the discussion, sharing our perspectives. And we'll try to spend about 15 minutes apiece on each one of these 4. So we'll talk about boundary spanning, redundancy, the rule of thumb of 90-9-1, and talk about community management. So the questions for discussion will be, how is this relevant in your specific projects? How does this work in practice? How does this relate to KM, to culture change, to strategy? So let's start by talking about the first one, and I'll spend a moment to set the stage and then we'll hear from you. So the first one is a principle that says communities should span boundaries. And what we mean by boundary spanning is that organizations sometimes will try to create communities that match the organization structure. They'll use organization-specific terminology. They'll assign people in, and they'll even name the community with the name of some organization. And the principle that I espouse is that you should actually try to get communities that have people from multiple organizations that span organizational boundaries and aren't confined to a silo. So the more different organizations that contribute people to join a community, the better. That includes multiple geographies, parts of the world, cultures, and so forth, languages even. So the more diversity in a community, the better. And the more that it's very much the same and everybody comes from one organization and tends to do the same kind of work or think the same kind of way, that limits the effectiveness of a community. So with that as the background, how is that relevant? Have you seen this? Do you have a different view? Some of these positions that I'm taking, you may not agree with, and that's fine. If you've seen something else, by all means, let us know what your experience has been. But have you seen communities that are very narrow and fall within a silo? Have you seen communities that try to get people from multiple organizations, and which ones have you seen work well and not so well?
One thing I can say on that, Stan, is I would say my background is in organizational change and learning and development. And I would say one concept that gets the most amount of deafening silence when raised in the context of change and learning is community management. Organizations just either think, don't we do that anyway within our structure? Or they don't know what it is and they just think it's, oh, that's Twitter. It's really hard to get leaders of the organization on board with that. The one area where I have seen it work well, and I'll be interested to get your thoughts on this, is what we now call multidisciplinary teams, which I think is, as you said, structure does not answer culture, or structure does not answer community. This was an attempt by organizations to create multidisciplinary teams, people from across the organization, but it's entrenched with organizational speak, and it's almost become so rigid in the way it's been authorized that the effectiveness of the community is completely lost. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that organizations that try to sort of manage communities in the sense of will constrain how they're defined, who can be in them, what they're going to be talking about, that's counterproductive. You want communities to essentially evolve from the topics that are most important to the people in the organization, not from the top down, but more from the bottom up. And when you try to be real rigid with things, I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example that of, from 2 different organizations that I worked in. In HP, when I was there, I often get people saying, well, I don't want my community to be open to people from such and such an organization. So let's say it was a technical community. They might say, we don't want any salespeople in here. We just want engineers to be in here to talk amongst themselves. The salespeople will detract from our technical discussions. And I would try to explain to them that, isn't it possible that you might learn something from the salespeople who are out trying to sell the products that you're developing? Wouldn't it potentially help you to know what the customers are telling their sales reps? And wouldn't it potentially be useful for the sales reps to learn from you and be able to interact? And if you have a question for them, or if they have a question for you, that those questions could be exchanged. So to try to get them out of the mode of, we only want this to be limited to this type of person, but that there was a benefit to them to have other types of people, was one example. And an example from Deloitte, they tended to want to only have communities to match their practice structure. So instead of saying we should have a community that includes all people who are interested in a topic, let's say the topic was security. Instead of saying anyone in Deloitte, regardless of what practice they work in, regardless of which member firm they belong to, if they're interested in security, they should join the community. Instead, they would say, no, we only want this to be for the Australian security practice that works in the advisory consulting business. And we don't want any people from any other discipline. We don't want any from any other part of the world. And then I would try to say, is it going to be harmful if somebody who knows about security who resides in a different country joins your community? Isn't it possible that they might add something? They might answer a question. They might learn from being a part of it. So trying to help people see that keeping out people doesn't really help your community. It actually hurts it. You could over time make that case, but you had to realize that reluctance of being open and diverse was there. What are some other thoughts people have seen in this topic?
Hi Stan, it's Nikki. I'm curious about the use in projects that you've raised there. I have never used or promoted a community as part of a project, and I see great value. So I'm curious if other people have used communities to support, I'm assuming, quite large projects. Is it used at a startup, in a startup area? Is it used as part of a change strategy? So I'm just curious that you put that up there.
Well, I'll answer and then I'll see if other people have answers. There's two answers that come to mind. One is, I think of it as being a supplement to the work on a project. So if you have a team working on a project and they may each have a different specialty that they bring to that project, I would want them to all belong to the relevant communities that relate to their specialty, right?
Okay.
So when they need some help, they can get it and bring it into the project from elsewhere, from the communities. That's my first thought. And then the second thought is that you want people to be able to share what they've learned from the projects back into other places, and they can benefit outside of that project. So if I share from my project into the broader community and I say, this is what we learned from this one, I hope that would help other projects doing similar work. So it's going to benefit more than that one project. Hopefully it benefits the larger organization.
So it's more taking on that boundary spanner versus a community specifically for that project.
That's right. I don't think a community community for a project would work, but being a member of a relevant community would help a project is the way I look at it.
Gotcha. Thanks for clarifying that.
It's Nathan here. I look after knowledge management at the ACCC, and sort of not contrary, but maybe just in addition to that point, we've certainly had some success with things that look a little bit like communities for specific projects. For example, in the last year or so, we did we updated our records management system from Trim to iManage, and we had a network of I guess sort of local or business area contacts that kind of operated a bit more like how I would perceive a community to operate in terms of sharing what their experience within their business area was, which has worked quite well. And in previous projects, we've had slightly less structured sort of champion groups, which I've always found from a change management perspective to be sort of the bare minimum that you would like to do for your sort of outward stakeholder engagement, at least. But thinking on that, there's definitely some ways that you could potentially communitize them a little bit more and make them a bit more interactive between the project, all of the project group, and the non-actively project members, I guess, anyway. I did have a couple other random thoughts, but maybe I'll stop there.
Well, please share them.
Well, this was just more about my experience at the ACCC, and as I mentioned in the breakout group, we've got about 10 active communities of practice, which may also, some of those might actually be more rightly called communities of interest, but I would say it's the ones that are more like a community of interest that are more successful. So the ones that are a bit more of a broader topic. So things like, just a couple of examples, we've got one on what we call disruptive technologies. So there's no division at the ACCC for dealing with disruptive technologies, but it's about things like, what's the blockchain, what implications is blockchain going to have on the economy, or driverless cars going to have on other industries that we may need to regulate. That one's obviously got a broad appeal across the whole organisation. But then we've also got things like we've got an economic network group, which we do actually have kind of an economic cohort, but we've also got plenty of people with economics backgrounds working across the organisation. So that's quite interesting. It generates a fair amount of interest. And we more recently have been having sort of discussions about structure and silo busting, which is the perennial problem, I think, at any large organisation. And certainly the communities of practice have featured in that, in terms of being a horizontally spanning concept that we've already got, that we could potentially leverage, instead of trying to push into the whole paradigm of having, dynamic teams or I'm not sure, Christopher, sorry, I think you mentioned a term. I can't remember what term you used, but it sounded like that sort of thing.
Well, thanks, Nathan. A couple more thoughts came to mind about the role of projects in communities. One is the project can often be the initial impetus for creating a community. So if a project's going on a particular subject, it may be that the members of that project team might be the initial ones to create a community. Hopefully that community would grow and include people from other projects, but it might start in one. So if I'm working on a project to deliver a network design, and if there isn't already a networking community, that might be the impetus to create one. And then over time, you would hope that it would broaden. And the other thought that came to mind is how you can use a particular project. In this case, I was involved in the merger planning for Compaq and Hewlett-Packard. And one of the things that I thought would be very helpful is if we used communities as part of that project to get the merger to succeed from the first day. If we had a community set up for each important topic to both pre-merger companies, and if on day one we could have everybody come together on the subject in which they shared specialty, I thought it would have really helped get the merger off to a good start. That I made that suggestion. We didn't do that, and I think it was unfortunate. It would have really helped, I think, accelerate the progress of the merger.
Dan,
any other thoughts on boundary spanning?
Carolyn has thrown up a comment in the chat. Carolyn, I don't know whether you want to speak to that briefly.
Thanks, Arthur. Yeah, look, we've used champions a lot, and we don't like the word champion, I must admit, and we look for other turns of phrase, because but we use the word champion because people are championing the cause, etc., etc. So it goes back to what Nathan was saying. It's a great thing for us, and we use it for more than technology. We actually use it for lots of other changes, including putting in place our new strategy. So it's really good. That's all. Thank you.
So the discussion here about community of practice, community of interest, is an interesting one. I pretty much just refer to communities and don't try to differentiate them, but there is sort of a difference that has historically been there. And you can think of it as, at least the way I think about it, is that the community of practice relates to our work, and the community of interest relates to something else, right? So I've always encouraged communities of interest to be supported along with communities of practice so that people can get comfortable with the concept of being in a community. And that way, if you have a community for something which is a hobby or a social activity, and people are used to coming together and using tools and interacting online and so forth, then that translates nicely over into when they have to use it for a work community. So my own experience with that happened at Digital Equipment Corporation. I joined them in 1983, and there were already communities of practice. They were called Vax Notes conferences, but they span both interest and practice. There were technical communities focused on the products, but there were also communities like for the skiing club of New England, right? So that encouraged people to join the ski club, get comfortable with using the Vax Notes conference as the online tool and the way that they went about searching and sharing, but then they could apply that when they used it in a work-related topic. So that's how I've usually differentiated.
Stan, just before you leave boundaries, I know you're ready to jump to the next one, but KMLF have a policy of deliberately trying to connect our community with some other community at least a couple of times a year. So we try and go out and, you know, whether it's a creativity community or some sort of non-knowledge based community. And that has always generated more value. I just see Nikki has just stuck her hand up. Nikki, we'll need to move to the next topic fairly quickly. If you've got a quick comment on this one before we go.
It might come up in another topic. It's really about just taking community of interest, community of practice, and community of excellence, that next step around the community of excellence and understanding or having that discussion around what do people see the difference between the practice and the excellence, and should we even worry about that distinction, and how does that fit with boundary spanning as well? So we can talk about that in later if you prefer.
Nikki, my short answer to that would be don't worry about it, but we can talk some more. To answer one more question from Timothy about would I assign people, another one of the principles that we're not discussing today is that communities should be voluntary. So I think it's good to encourage people to join and to suggest what might be a good community for them to join, but I do think they should choose to join rather than be forced to join. I think that makes a big difference in how effective they are. So I would have set up the communities. I would have told all the people in both pre-merger companies, here they are, please join the ones that are most relevant to you, but I wouldn't have forced them into any of them.
Okay, it's interesting, but yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Okay, so the next one is minimize redundancy in communities. So this is a principle that says you should only have one community for a topic. And there isn't complete agreement on this. Some people think that communities shouldn't be directly controlled, that they should be allowed to form organically, and that the survival of the fittest ought to work. So if a community can thrive, then it will last, and if it doesn't, it will die, and that's the way it should work. My own experience is that that doesn't work, because if you create 10 communities on the same topic, they will all die, right? So none of them will ever reach critical mass, and people will be fragmented and frustrated, and they won't have all the people connected together who would potentially benefit from being connected. So in this case, my own view is this is one case where control is actually in the interests of the users, not necessarily because you're trying to be, a controlling organization, but you're saying to the user, we want to make it easy for you. There will only be one community for a topic. It'll be easy for you to decide that's the one to join, and you'll be connected to everyone else who's interested in that topic. So that principle says, don't allow things to proliferate, but actually limit them so that we get effective single community per topic. Obviously, some people may disagree, so I'm interested, what do people think about this principle?
In my experience, that's completely right, Stan. We had similar troubles when we had multiple communities running around the world at Cadbury, and everyone wanted their own little community. And the other one that's associated with this, going back to your previous one about spanning boundaries, is they all wanted their little community to be secret. We don't want other people to know that, we've got this little group going. But I got around that by saying all content in all communities is open and accessible by everyone in the system, because we all work for the same company, right? Unless there is a specific reason to lock a document. And people went absolutely nuts and crazy. But what they found then, that once that rule was put in place, only a small percentage of the documents were actually locked down. And then people from other communities and parts of the network, parts that didn't even know the communities existed, when they were doing searches, they could find things and then actually connect with them. So it works so much better when they're open, and you minimize the number of separate communities. Completely agree.
Yeah, I agree with that, Arthur, completely. And also the idea that we need our own is a very common thing. We need our own.
Yeah.
We don't want to be part of that other one. We need our own, and you have to really work with them to see that that's not necessarily helpful to them or anyone else.
True.
Sometimes
It's really important with small to medium enterprises as well, because you just get death very quickly. You've got a small number of people wanting to be in a lot of communities, so trying to put that structure there in an informal sense is quite important.
People have other experiences or views on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I almost feel like I have the opposite problem that often when I think that perhaps a community should be spun up for something, people are very nervous about whether it has any sort of small overlap with anything else. And sometimes that can even just constitute overlap of members, which I personally don't think is a problem, other than obviously the more groups that you're a member of, the more time you might have to invest into them. But interested to know about that.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question, is how broad and how narrow can a community be to be successful? It clearly can't be too broad, because it would just be unworkable. If you had said a community is going to be focused on technology, for example, unless you were in a company where technology wasn't even important at all, that might make sense. But in most situations, that'd be too broad. You need to narrow it down. But then when you narrow it down, and this is another common problem that's similar to what Arthur brought up about, need our own. It's that I need one for this extremely narrow niche topic, which is important to me, but it may not be important to anyone else. So I think I should have a community that's focused on, and then pick something really, really narrow and specific, and it will never reach critical mass because there aren't enough people that care about that. So to your question, Nathan, about they complain, oh wait, you're starting up a new community that overlaps with something. You have to ask yourself, or what's the broadest that it can be and still be reasonable? And that's where I would start. And then if over time it turns out that the discussions reveal that there's a niche that's within that's got a high volume of activity, it can always be spun off. So I always say start as broad as you can without being too broad, and then spin off to narrower ones as warranted by actual evidence. And sometimes you'll never have to do that. It'll just work. But if they complain that your overlap is such that you think that's an unreasonable thing, then you can say, all right, well, let's stay in the one community for now. But if we see that there's a high volume of discussion on this topic that I want to split off, then we'll split it off, and we'll have essentially justification for that.
So Stan, I work for EY, so obviously a competitor of Deloitte. And I think what I've observed is, and I absolutely agree, it's good for me because I cover the government sector, the people who advise government clients. Ideally, I would like to have one global education community. But I've also found that people tend to share less, they're less willing to share in communities if it's too big, because they feel like they're not important enough to make a sort of a post or announcement or whatever, or just talk to a really big audience. They feel more comfortable in a smaller group, which is frustrating. I wonder if you've ever come across that sort of issue before.
I have, thank you for that. Yeah, and I've had that articulated to me. My own view on it is this, that part of that problem is a cultural problem, that you have to try to nurture the culture of a community so there's less fear of doing that. You can't eliminate it, but you can maybe make it safer for them posting in the big community. The problem with the idea that you'll be more likely to share in smaller communities is that it's not really backed up by any real evidence. My own experience is the smaller the community, the less likely that anybody will ever post anything. So they may say that I'll be more comfortable posting in my small community. But if you ever had experience with that, where you try to form a 10-person community, there could be an initial flurry of posts, but pretty quickly it's down to nothing. And that'll be addressed in our topic where we talk about the rule of 90%. But because of that, it's more like they have good intentions, or they say that they'll be more likely to post in small community. But in reality, you need large communities, just because 10% is the only likely amount that will ever post anything. And so if you have a community that 1,000 people are in, the ones that say they won't post in there because it's too big, they're probably not going to post at all, right? They're just part of that 90% that typically doesn't post. So making it smaller won't increase their chances of posting. It'll just make 90%, maybe 1% will become 0 people, right? So I'd say the best way to answer that is to say, all right, if you're not comfortable posting, there are other ways. You know, I can post for you, or we can provide a way for you to submit it anonymously. There's workarounds for people that are shy. But I always say, if you have a community that's 1,000 people large, and then the 1,001st person joins, what would be the problem with that? Would that cause a problem? No, that 1,001st person might have some useful answers for the questions that are sitting there. So I always say the communities really can't be too big unless the volume gets to be too big. If they get to be where the volume is great and you get, you know, overwhelmed by the posts, then you need to do something about that. But if not, the bigger the community, if the volume is acceptable, I think that's always better than having smaller separate communities where the discussions won't be connected. Somebody will post something in the small one and somebody somewhere else won't see it. That's too big of a risk to allow for it. So what I would do is I would work with people to try to help them through their concern about posting in the big group, welcome them, thank them for posting, encourage them, praise them. That's the thing that I've done over time to try to encourage people who are maybe reluctant to post in a bigger community.
One thing I would say on that too, Timothy, two things came to mind. I agree with the numbers that Stan says. The numbers that I always believe around community management is the 70-20-10 rule. So 10% are going to be your active publishers, 20% are your active reactors. So they will comment or put a little smiley face or whatever. And then you've got 70% who are passives. And time and again, I've seen that ratio be pretty true. So you kind of have to accommodate for the three different types of people. And the best thing I've seen to do is, rather than creating large groups and small groups, it's up to the community leaders to create a diversity of forums. So you can't just expect everyone to be able to publish or talk to a 50-person room. What you do is you create experiences where there might only be 5 people, like, you know, publicize a coffee chat or something where people can say, oh, there's only 5 of us, but we can still meet anyway. It doesn't need to reach that critical mass. So you've got the combination of that large group environment and the small group to help keep everything bubbling along.
Yes, and Nathan, to follow on that, if you have, you know, like we would call local chapters of communities, can be another way where the local chapter meets in person, discuss the bigger call that everybody's on, or the local chapter may speak in their local language, which is not the language of the broader community. So there's several ways to do that. As long as you keep that as part of the larger community rather than separate from it, that can be very effective.
I agree.
Does anybody have experience where redundancy was a good thing?
I've not seen it, no, Sam.
Any other comments on this one before we move to the next one? All right, the next one we were kind of hinting at, and Nathan just quoted a different number, but the 99-1 rule of thumb is undefeated, is a statement I would make. This chart that you see on here comes from Jakob Nielsen, who's one of the usability experts, but he's written about this a long time ago. These charts come from him. And I like to quote him because in one of his articles about this topic, he said, what can you do about this rule of thumb? Can you overcome it? And his answer was, you can't. That has been my experience as well. I don't know that I can explain why this rule applies. I'm not sure anybody can, but it does seem to be an absolute like rule of nature, law of nature. And we've actually, my friend Lee Romero and I did some extensive analytical work on this topic to try to say, not just what do we think or what do we sense or what do we feel, but what are we really able to measure? And we did it in 3 different contexts. We did it with the SICAM leaders community. We did it with the knowledge management community at Deloitte. And we did it with the posts that I make on LinkedIn. And we did analysis of all 3 of those to see what could we uncover. Was the 99-1 rule was a real rule, or was it something different? And it turns out for us in the research we did, that is actually higher than 90. It's more like 95% of people generally won't post in an online setting. I've always taken the position that that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. So I don't view lurkers as a negative thing. I view that as being fine. If those people are paying attention And if they're learning in the community, then I think they're getting value from it. And I would never tell them they need to do something else, right? Now, if they're not paying any attention and they're not reading the posts and they're not attending the calls, and they're not learning anything from the community, then I would call that person a join-only member. They don't have anything that's really happening in the community. They're just a member in name only. But if they read and follow and participate, even if they never post, that to me is fine. The community is benefiting them. So my view on this is no one has ever presented any empirical data to me that says that this rule doesn't apply. There have been several articles written with survey data that claims to show that it's different. But if you have actual data in our actual community where you can measure the actual number of different posters over a period of time, then that would be helpful to modify this. But anyway, the data that Lee and I analyzed in 3 different settings supported it. So what do you do about it? You don't, first of all, lament it. You don't, don't belittle lurkers, or maybe don't even call them lurkers. Call them the 90% that's learning from the community, and that's good. And then encourage them to continue doing that. And then hope that you have a large enough community, meaning you reach critical mass, so that the 9% and the 1% are meaningful numbers of people. Thoughts about that?
Rings true to me, Stan. With, well, I've been part of your community, SIKM leaders in the US for a long time. And even these calls, I mean, you look at KMLF has a community membership of about 550, but today we have 15, we probably have an average of around 20, 25, when it's an evening thing. So it's really good. I see, Eli, you're throwing in a comment. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, I just said that an Israeli research on a large government community had the numbers 4, 21, and 76. It was, I think, it was also published as an article in a journal. I'm not sure that in English, but definitely in Hebrew.
Over what period of time and what type of community was that done, Eli?
It was of social workers in the government.
Well, if you have that research, I haven't seen that, but if that's in fact comparing an online community similar to what we were looking at, that would be a different result than what we observed.
But I'll check if
Okay.
it was published in English.
Okay, thank you.
It's Nathan here. The thought that this kind of prompted for me was just around the challenges that I've sort of felt like I've had trying to transition people from broadly face-to-face community stuff to, utilizing things like Microsoft Teams due to COVID, obviously. And yeah, there does seem to be a bit of pushback around, starting up an actual team in Teams. Hopefully people are familiar with what that means, but basically having, your online digital kind of presence. A lot of people sort of go, I don't check that, so why would anyone else? So I think having this heuristic could actually be useful to kind of say to people, well, it doesn't matter if most people don't check, as long as some people do. Well, maybe not check, but not contribute. But yeah, it's an interesting one, especially depending on the size of the groups. I guess it could fall over pretty easy if the groups are smaller, as you said.
Right, the size, this relates very much to the size. The original principle in the Communities Manifesto was that size is important. Take steps to reach critical mass. And the question is, what is critical mass? And it could vary, but Lee and I did some work on that also at Deloitte with our Yammer community to see what was the number that a group needed to reach before we felt like it was thriving. And it turned out our research showed that it was actually 200 people in a group. Now, I used to use the number 50 originally, then I upped it to 100. But it's all based on sort of a simple computation. If you have 100 people in a community, and if only 10% of them will ever post or do anything, then that's 10 people. And 10 people is probably enough to have a little diversity. But if you had a group of 10 people, then 10% of 10 is 1. And so one person is the only one ever posting. That's not likely to succeed. So consequently, anywhere where you get up to where 10% of the number is a reasonably good number, that's good. So it's no absolute here, but anyway, our work did show that 200 worked as a good indicator for our Yammer groups at Deloitte. When we got above 200, we could pretty much predict that the community would stay active because enough different people were posting in it, and when questions got asked, they received answers in a timely way. In the smaller communities, what we found is there was seldom any posts. Questions would remain unanswered, generally things that show that the community is not doing well.
Which sort of goes back to my question for small to medium enterprises. And I'm talking, I know the numbers vary of what they say a SME is, but if we're saying companies that are under 200, it becomes very problematic to have strong communities. And from my experience, it's a challenge getting the organisation to be comfortable with setting communities up that are bringing people in from other organisations. Have people had that experience, and how can you overcome that? I know that's sort of really a mentality with management for them to realise, feeling safe around competition and disclosure of information and trade practice secrets versus the benefits of having this knowledge sharing.
I can give you an example of that just very quickly, Nikki. And by the way, Stan, you're talking about boundary spanners. Simon Terry has just picked up on one of the tweets under the KMLF. Simon's in the UK and he's chipping in on Twitter as well. So we are spanning boundaries as we speak. But the example that I would use for that, Nikki, it really takes a mindset shift. And I remember we had all of these communities running, and there was one guy who was the leader of a function within the company. And he was saying, well, my people don't have time to go to communities. I mean, they're too busy, rah, rah, rah. But after a few projects in the community that we went back to him and said, look, this is what actually comes out of the other end of the community, and there were cases where there were millions of dollars in value created by the community because of the way it was operating. Eventually, we got him to the point where when somebody presented him with a proposal, he would say, have you bounced that off the community yet? And if the answer was no, he said, well, it's not ready for me to look at it. So, you've got to show that there is huge benefit for the stakeholders coming out of the community. And when you can demonstrate that, by the value that it creates, then you can use that as leverage to change people's mindsets.
Yeah, I think several thoughts come to mind, Nikki, about your point. First of all, if you have a very small company of 200 or fewer people, it's doubtful that you want to have multiple communities in it because none of them would have critical mass. So in a case like that, you might actually start out by having one community that was just the company community, right? And that's where threaded discussions about anything would initially occur. And over time, you might spin off some others if the community grows or if the volume warrants. But you mentioned the point about having communities that span boundaries, and that would fit as well. I've often felt that an internal only community is inherently limiting. If you have an internal knowledge management community at a place like Deloitte, it's doubtful that it will have as much knowledge about knowledge management as the external community SICAM leaders does. So rather than asking the people inside of Deloitte a knowledge management question, they'd be better off asking it outside of Deloitte. Now, your point about it, well, what about competition and competitive secrets and so forth? That's going to be an objection that will get raised, but good knowledge managers usually figure out a way to do it anyway. I think about having communities that I've been in where we had people who were competitors like Accenture and Ernst & Young and Deloitte and PwC and KPMG all belonging to a community. And in theory, we were all competing and we shouldn't have shared anything. But of course we shared with each other. So to me, if you set up that thing where it spans the companies, you may have to downplay it so people don't get nervous, but just let it work. Or just tell people, go join this community. It's external and it will be the place that you can go and get your question answered.
Tim, did you want to speak to the comment that you just posted on the chat?
Okay, so the question from Pam was, I think Accenture tried making contributions to communities as part of people's performance review. And I think what we found at EY is that it can help in some cases, but in others, people just sort of tick the box. So they say, yes, I've made a contribution, but the actual contribution was not that full of value. So I think there is probably other ways of doing it. I mean, you're always trying to do different things, but that it wasn't a silver bullet.
But my own experience with that at HP, we established a program called KM Stars that actually Accenture took and borrowed and reused. And the principle was you were given a point every time you posted in an online discussion. And in theory, that could have been gamed. You know, people could make pointless posts just to earn a point. And there actually was one person who did that, but that person, we dealt with that person. But the rest, it actually did work. I don't think it changes the 90% number. It just makes it more likely that people will join the community and do something once in a while. But it definitely helped our community membership numbers, which we measured, and then probably increased slightly the number of people that might be inclined to post or reply in a community. All right, any other questions, comments, thoughts, experiences about this rule of thumb or about the size of communities?
If there's no other comments, I'll just throw something in that's really, really important here, Stan, and something that both you and I are personally experiencing. Because there's the 9% intermittent contributors and 1% heavy, rolling over the leadership is really important, and the building up of those intermittent contributors into heavy contributors so they become the next generation of leaders is something that we all struggle to do, you know, building the passion in the next level. I think you've done it well and KMLF have done it well. Do you want to comment on that at all? Because that's a knowledge succession type of activity to get the community going beyond the founders.
Yes, Arthur, that's something you and I have discussed and it's come up in the SICAM leaders community. It's an interesting challenge. You want to not be dependent on a single person for a variety of good reasons. But I've also seen where ones that have tried to have a more democratic election-oriented approach have struggled with that. So let me give you an example. That the group that was called KM Chicago used to be an active community. I used to sometimes attend their meetings and presented a few times at their meetings, and they were lively, and Chicago is a big city and there are a lot of people there, and it thrived for quite some time. But unlike SICAM, which is something that I've nurtured over the 16 years that it's existed, this one, every year they'd have an election and they'd have a different president, they'd have a board of directors, and they'd have a vice president, secretary, they had all these offices, and it seemed like that was a way of ensuring continuity. But in fact, I don't think it's active anymore, right? So there can be a drawback if you don't have a sustaining sort of person who's interested in keeping it sustained. It can fall off if a different set of officers takes over who don't put that same effort in. So the concept's important. I mean, you don't want to have SICAM come to an end if I disappeared. But at the same point, if I said, okay, I'm turning it over to the newly elected leader this year, and they didn't do very much, that would be a shame, right? So I think you want some kind of nice intermediate thing where I've tried to do that by having somebody named as my co-manager. So if I'm not around, she can take over for me. But I tried to pick somebody that shared the same level of passion that I have so that it wouldn't take a hit if I disappeared. So that would be part of it. The other thing is we experimented with champions. That word came up earlier. When we had a recent discussion in SICAM, there was a suggestion we should have some champions, essentially to take off some of the moderation duties from me and spread them around. And that's good, and I welcome that. But what we found was, I don't know if it was just a fluke or what, but the champions didn't really do much of anything, right? So it sounded good. There was initial flurry of interest, but it sort of tapered off. So until such time as you can get to the point where, you know, that actually works, and I think that works better in maybe in KM4 Dev where they have, you know, changing moderators and they seem to sustain better. But in my own experience with it, it didn't seem to go anywhere. I gave them some things I thought could be helpful if they would take them on. They didn't seem to do that. So at this point, I guess both things can work. I don't know if there's a single answer to it.
Yeah, I don't think there is either, Stan, but it really is important for communities like KMLF and SIKM leaders, KM for Dev, you know, to continue going. And I agree with you. I guess it just comes back to getting the right individuals leading.
There was one interesting thing. I was approached by Edwin K. Morris, who runs a nonprofit called Pioneer Knowledge Services. And he also runs this podcast series called what you should because you need to know.
Yeah, that's it.
And,
yeah.
He asked me if I would essentially bequeath my knowledge to their nonprofit. So when I pass on with all the stuff that's on my website and all the things I've written and recorded over the years, instead of it just sort of disappearing, that it would live on. And so I agreed to that. So now he has essentially a will from me that says all of my content is willed to Pioneer Knowledge Services, a nonprofit, and he has the access to my site and the password and so forth. So if I suddenly drop dead, Edwin could go in and retrieve all of that so it could live on. So I think that's a very important point. You don't want knowledge to die.
Yeah.
And a related point to that is that platforms can suddenly go away on you. So even if the leader is still there, their platform can disappear. We saw what happened with ACT KM in the past, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So that's sort of a tragic thing that happened. And you don't want that to happen, but you have to recognize it could happen. So what are you going to do? And we had that happen with Yahoo Groups going away, and we were successful in migrating to groups.io. But I think you got to be always thinking, what are we going to do if this platform dies, and what's our contingency plan?
Absolutely right. Thank you.
All right, let's move to the fourth point, which is communities need to be actively nurtured. And so the book that I wrote is about community management. It's become a buzzword in the world, not just for knowledge management, but for marketing and for brands and so forth. But what do we really think we need to be as community managers? This graphic here dates back to when I was writing the Communities Manifesto about what the activities were of a community leader, scheduling events, hosting the events, making sure the questions get answered, posting to keep the discussions alive, and expanding the community in terms of membership and content. So to me, the single most important thing, and we were just hinting at it, Arthur, the leader is the key thing for the ongoing success of any community. And if there's good leaders, the communities that have good subjects that people relate to will probably continue to thrive. And SIKM now has been going for 16 years. How long has KMLF been around?
In its current form, about the same. I mean, there was a bit of a pre-community both here and in New South Wales, which Matt Moore is part of. So 1998 was the first official KMLF. So it's been going a little bit longer, but there was a very, very lean period in there where realistically it really didn't survive. And sort of Keith and I and a couple of others really revitalized it back. So it's a sister or a twin of SIKM.
Okay. So the leadership's important. The leadership activities is important. I also think the culture of a community is important. It has to have the right sort of vibe. When people join it, they feel like they're comfortable there. No one's threatening them. If they were to ask a question, they wouldn't get ridiculed for doing that. If they were to make a post, that people would appreciate that. If you can set that tone, and you can also make it so that someone does ask a question, always gets an answer. And to me, that starts the starting point. Then you can say to people, hey, if you join this community, I can assure you that if you need any help, you'll get it. If you want to learn about the subject, you'll learn about it. If you want to meet other people who are similarly interested, you'll meet them. That's the kind of promise community leaders should make. In order to do that, then they have to do basic things like monitoring the community and stimulating it sometimes and scheduling speakers. One of the things I do for SIKM is just scheduling the speakers. I schedule them way out in advance, and they just roll along. But that doesn't happen by itself. Someone has to do that. And when you do, it doesn't take that much time. It just takes a little bit of steady time. To me, that's really the key. It's not that you have to spend inordinate amounts of time leading communities, but you got to do it regularly.
Yeah, I think in the modern world, a lot of people kind of learn, well, what do I get if I join? You know, it's the wrong question, right? The leading question is, you know, how can I contribute to this community and how can I become part of it and, you know, build trust and relationships and all of the intangibles. And when you do that, you get so much more than you input in return. You know, our friendship is a good example. You know, you've been part of KMLF, I've been part of SIKM. You know, the friendship is way more powerful than any sort of amount of time that I've put in. And I think that's the thing when people are so busy, they get to the stage of, yeah, but where's the value for me? What's in it for me, right? If they can get past that and invest a little, they'll get more in return. Has that been your experience as well?
Definitely. It's an interesting one, Arthur, that comes up a lot. I'm sure you get this experience as well. People regularly contact me privately with questions.
Yep.
They want to ask me a question through an email or a LinkedIn chat or whatever. And I always respond the same way, which is I'm glad to help you, but I would like you to post your question in the community
Yep.
rather than privately.
Yep.
And I say there's two benefits to that. One is other people respond to you, not just me, and you may benefit from the broader set of responses. And all the other people, including the 90% who may never post but are reading, will
Yep.
benefit as well.
Yeah.
And you know, some of the time they won't do that, some of the time they do. But to me, by just always insisting on that is a way of getting to what you're saying, that they think they don't want to do that, you know, just want a quick answer, you know, but if I can convince them to go ahead and do that post, almost always they get a much richer set of responses than if it was just the two of us in exchanging.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's the thing about, you know, a question is a contribution, because if you're thinking this and you're not sure and you have trouble finding, you know, some insights or guidance on that particular topic, then probably a whole bunch of other people in the community do as well. And, you know, that even asking a question is a significant contribution.
It definitely is. And I always try to thank them, you know, if they're a new member that I steered in, thank them for posting here. I like their post. Anybody that responds to them, I like their response. I mean, trying to, you know, give them essentially feedback that says, great, you know, this is how this works. And whenever that happens, that person posts their question, gets a lot of good answers. I always feel like the community is working.
Other people?
Something that I've tried to encourage the groups to do is to you know, vary their session design and include things like, you know, problem solving sessions. And I think the way you articulated it, Arthur, about sort of giving people opportunities to contribute is a good way to put that forward, because I think that's essentially what I'm trying to get at with that advice.
You know, it's interesting. You just jogged my memory about something that happened recently. There was a discussion about lessons learned in SIKM. A question was posted and there was lots of response, and it was a really good discussion. And I'm sure Arthur was one of the ones making good responses there. And then Tom Garfield said, well, why don't we have a peer assist? And he scheduled one and he led it, and a number of people participated. And I think that was great. And then in the past, Tom has been one in the past that would sometimes question, well, why do we always just have speakers on our monthly calls? Why don't we have more conversations? And my answer is the community should be whatever the members want it to be. If they want to have discussions or peer assists or anything else, they can, right? It shouldn't be like viewed as my community and I decide what happens. But the flip side of that is they actually have to then follow through and do it. In this case, Tom did. He actually didn't just suggest that we have a peer assist. He scheduled and led one. And I think if we could get more people that would recognize that, you know, you can do anything you want in the community. It doesn't belong to me or to Arthur. It belongs to the members. But it also implies that they have to take some responsibility, and some of the time they've got to step up and do something. And if they don't, they shouldn't then later say, why is the community always operating this way? Well, they could change that if they wanted to. So nurturing isn't just the community leader, it's also the members.
With KMLF, and I don't know if it happens every year, but when I was on the organising committee a couple of times, we did a retrospective at the end of the year with the whole of the community. And that was great because you got additional ideas to take forward for the next year around, you know, what was working well, what did they think we could do better, and you actually acted on that. So that's a really good way to engage the community and find out what what other ideas or what other formats. And at the same time, if somebody raises it, you can then engage with them to say, that's a great idea. Would you like to organise a session? And if you're doing it well in advance, if you're doing it on a monthly basis, that's only 12 sessions a year. You've got to fill the slots, or 11 sessions with filling the slot, because the last one's the retrospective. And we found that worked really, really well.
Yeah, I think that's important. I wanted to give one counterexample of a community at Deloitte that worked really well without any nurturing at all, but this is an exception to the rule. It was called the Excel Tips and Tricks Yammer Group. It was not officially sanctioned by anybody. It had no sponsorship. Nobody asked for it to exist. It didn't align to any organization, expand across all of Deloitte. But it was the largest and most active Yammer group. And if you had a question about Excel, you would get an answer within minutes. So it tells you that in a case like that, where there's so much interest in a topic and there's so many people that are willing to, quickly answer it, that can be self-sustaining, but most communities don't reach that state. They don't have a topic that's that widely interesting and have that many people who are compelled to answer. So it can happen, but it's probably the exception. It also tells you a lot about Deloitte, that people were very interested in Excel spreadsheets.
I remember there was a similar community at SAP, the software, ERP software and company. And this is going back to late 1990s, I suppose. I don't know whether it still exists. It was called Sapphire, and they used to have a big annual conference. And it was amazing. You could ask any question about anything in that community. And it was all volunteers, experts, who just, maybe they just wanted brownie points or whatever, but it actually worked really, really well for a long time.
Timothy has posted that the biggest Yammer group was Pets of EY. So I think that's great. That gets back to our earlier discussion about having communities of interest. And I definitely encouraged that at Deloitte. And we had a photography group and we had a music group, and they were very active. And the thought was, if people would, use Yammer for those purposes, they might also then use it for, some of the work groups as well.
It's kind of interesting how we were saying earlier that we don't want to have redundant groups. But at the same time, if something like the Pets of EY pops up, you don't say, oh, it's not relevant to EY's service lines. You just run with it because it brings people into that particular tool, and they may actually join something that's more relevant to their work. Yeah.
Right. But if there was a second Pets of EY, you might encourage them to combine.
Well, yeah, there is a Dogs of EY, which troubles me. I know. And I'm a dog person, but I'm happy to look at cats and rabbits as well. That's the thing.
So that's a good example, Timothy. So in a case like that, you might say to the person that started the Dogs EY, hey, that's great. Why don't we try it out within the pets first? And if it turns out that there's so much dog chatter, we'll split it off.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, we're going to wrap up in a moment. If there are any other questions, just before we sign off, of course, we'll keep the session going if anyone wants to stay and just generally chat. But in terms of formalizing, any other questions on Stan's principles and what we've been discussing today?
If not, I'll put up this last slide. This is where you can join SICAM if you're not a member. I encourage you to join. I will approve your request. You can also follow me on Twitter or go to my website, and then you see the books below, including the latest one, which is about communities. But the other ones have been of interest to people as well.
I can absolutely recommend joining SIKM Leaders. I flipped from active contributor to intermittent to lurker, and sometimes not being in for a couple of weeks at a time. But it really is a magnificent community, and the people in there are amazing. The 9% that do contribute are definitely worth engaging with. They're a great community. So thanks for doing that, Sinan.
Sure, you're welcome.
Any other things before we close up? You're getting lots of thanks on the chat, Stan, so that's all good.
Stan, can I ask you a question on a completely unrelated topic? Well, it is related. I recently worked for Lucidia Australia, and I know that you've been a knowledge champion for Lucidia, and I just wondered if they've been using, like, how they use your input. So.
Sure. Lucidia and I have had a very good relationship over the past multiple years. And it started out where they asked me to just be on a webinar where we're going to talk about pitfalls that you encounter in knowledge management. And it evolved to where I've done a lot of webinars with them. My second book that you see here, Proven Practices for Promoting a Knowledge Management Program, was published by Lucidia. And in fact, if you're interested in a copy of that, they will give you a free copy of it. You just have to ask. So that's nice. And then recently I've just been blogging for them. So every week another blog comes out on their blog that I write about knowledge management. So it's been a great relationship. They've been great to work with. And the nice thing is they don't ask me to ever do anything about pitching products, or I don't even know much about their products. They just want somebody that knows about knowledge management to talk about knowledge management. And they feel that itself will be good for the company. And I hope that it is. But that's a good way to approach it. So instead of saying write a blog post about XYZ product, they just say write about whatever you want to write about, and that's what I've been able to do. So I've been writing. I think I'm up close to 50 of the weekly blog posts now, and I'll just keep going as long as they want me to. And they're a good company, and they host a variety of events. They have other speakers and writers that talk about other topics like libraries and museums, but my area is knowledge management. So when they want to talk about that, they just basically have me talk about it or write about it. And that's what I do with Lucidia. So I don't work for Lucidia. I just basically write for them, and they publish it.
Okay.
All right. I see.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Stan. A good question. Thank you, Pam. I am going to wrap up the formal session and stop the recording. I won't stop the call immediately, but thank you very much, Stan, for what you're contributing. I think, what's on the screen currently just goes to show, the huge contribution you've made to knowledge management over a very long period of time. And for that, we are very grateful. Thank you for taking the time out a day after you've had your extra COVID shot, and hopefully not too much problems there. But thanks very much again, and I look forward to being able to catch up with you sometime again in future. All right, so that's it for formal. I'm stopping the recording, and if anyone wants to hang on and just shoot the breeze with Stan for a little bit for the next 10 minutes or so, that would be great.
Thanks, everybody. I have to go to another meeting.